So I have something to say. I have heard from a lot of people that the church and Christians are overly zealous on the pro-life issue. And I am just going to say that that is absolutely not true whatsoever. The church is not overly zealous. The church is not passionate about the pro-life issue. They're not passionate about advocating for life. And so any articles you see or any kind of pushback that you see from people who are saying, oh my gosh, it's the Christians that are all, pro-life, you're absolutely wrong, because there's actually, if you look at the studies with the Guttmacher Institute, I think it's something like 24% of the women who have abortions are Catholic, something like 18% are Baptist, and then like another 13 or 15% is like evangelicals. So if you take that percentage together, we actually have almost over 50% of women who abort actually are Christians. So I have something I deeply want to say about this. The church is mainly pro-choice. The church advocates in their silence for abortion. The church is so afraid to talk about their stance that most of them, and many of them, do not have any kind of statements for life within any kind of their value statements or their belief statements. In fact, many of them will say that they are pro-choice, in spite of the fact that it is very clear that all you need to do is read into the Bible, into Deuteronomy, where it's in Deuteronomy 30, where God says, I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life. It's simple. It's an open book test. I need to tell you my story. So I had an abortion when I was a teen. For years, I regretted it. For years, I struggled with my own frustration and my own lack of knowledge. But the truth is that when I really came to and I started to heal, I realized and I took responsibility and I knew that God had healed me. But I'm going to tell you something also. A righteous anger sort of rose up in the fact that I had been sitting in those pews and I had been sitting in youth group for years. So I had spent two days a week, probably the equivalent of, I would guess, like 6 hours a week inside of a church, where a church never once mentioned those scriptures, never once had the courage to talk to me about what they would do and what I should do if I ever got pregnant. And so the church is not overly zealous. The church is actually silent. And I'm going to tell you another thing, that when I became healed, when I became more aware of the facts of what's out there, and that most abortions actually, but most women who have abortions actually are Christian, I just started to get really upset because the church is too lukewarm. This is what God spits out. The church is I believe that God is disgusted with the church. I believe that the church in general is something that God doesn't even know or recognize. If he says all in Deuteronomy, choose life, and a little girl sitting there for the longest time never hears anybody talk to her about what that means and how relevant it is to her life as she grows up as a teenager, then I'm sorry, but the church is partially responsible. So I do hold the church partially responsible for my decision, and I refuse to let my girls and my son be ill-equipped when they head out into the world. So I've spent a lot of time teaching them. So for those of you out there who are mad at the Christians for being pro-life, you're absolutely wrong. The truth is that most Christians are not pro-life. Most Christians are not reading the Bible. Most Christians would rather be nice and quiet and not passionate and ill-informed about the fact that babies are being not only aborted, but literally possibly all the way up to 36 weeks allowed to be aborted or are being aborted. And so until you've walked through that journey and know the regret and know the struggle and know what it feels like throughout your life and having that kind of a loss, and then after the fact sort of feeling like, okay, it was my responsibility to be, but not, I was a kid, There were teachers, there were mentors, there were leaders that had a responsibility to talk to me and would not open their mouth. I'm wondering how many churches out there are still keeping their mouths quiet because they don't want to say anything because they consider it political. I wonder how many churches are afraid to say anything because they're afraid that their tithes are going to go down if they speak the truth of what God says in the Word. And so what I have to say is, I'm unfortunately telling you the truth right now that the church is not overly zealous. Most of the church is actually pro-choice. Most of the church is ignoring the Word of God and allowing their little girls and their little boys to go out and into the world and be subjected to basically the unbiblical lifestyle and values of the world, rather than acknowledging and preparing them to stand up as truly strong, empowered women of God and be able to walk through a difficult situation and co-labor with God even in a difficult time in order to birth their blessing. And so, no, the church isn't overly zealous on the subject of life. The church basically is 90% or at least 60%, as we see with the percentage of all the women going in for abortions, at least 60%, but most likely more, keeping their mouths shut because they don't want to ruffle any feathers.